February 11, 1943. The snow-covered wastes near Kharkov, Soviet Union. The air is a razor, cutting through the heavy wool coats of the Soviet 18th Tank Corps. Inside a T-34, the smell of diesel and unwashed bodies is thick. The commander, Mikhail, squinted through his periscope. In the distance, emerging from a tree line choked with frost, was a monster they had only heard of in frantic, garbled radio reports. It was the Panzerkampfwagen VI, the Tiger. To the Soviet crews, and later the British in Tunisia, the Tiger looked like a step backward. While the T-34 and the upcoming Panther featured elegant sloped armor designed to deflect shells, the Tiger was a brutalist monument of vertical plates. It was boxy. It was stubborn. To an engineer, it looked like a design from 1939, not 1943. The Allied tankers joked that the Germans had forgotten how to shape steel. They assumed that because the armor wasn't sloped, it would be an easy mark for their high-explosive rounds. But the laughter died the moment the Tiger's main gun barked. That gun was the 8.8 cm KWK-36. To understand why this gun changed the face of armored warfare, you have to look up, to the sky. Before it was the heart of the Tiger, the 88 was the Flak 1836. It was designed to fire a 20-pound shell 5 miles straight up into the air to swat B-17s and Lancasters out of the clouds. To achieve that kind of altitude, the gun required an immense propellant charge and a barrel long enough to ensure the shell reached hypersonic speeds before leaving the muzzle. When German General Erwin Rommel found his standard anti-tank guns bouncing harmlessly off British Matilda II tanks in the desert, he did something desperate. He pointed his anti-aircraft guns at the ground. He realized that a shell designed to punch through the thin skin of a bomber at 20,000 feet would move so fast that no tank armor on Earth could stop it at point-blank range. The transition from the Flak, anti-aircraft, to the KWK, tank gun, was the moment the Tiger stopped being a tank and started being a sniper. The German engineers at Krupp didn't just bolt the gun inside, they refined it. They added an electric priming system so the firing was instantaneous. They added a massive muzzle brake to soak up the violent recoil that would otherwise have flipped a smaller tank on its back. Back on the Russian steppe, Mikhail's T-34 was moving at full tilt. He was 1,500 yards out. In tank combat of the era, this was considered long range. Most tank battles happened at 500 to 800 yards. Mikhail felt safe. He was waiting to get closer to ensure a hit. He didn't realize that for the Tiger crew, 1,500 yards was like shooting a stationary target in a gallery. The Tiger's gunner, using the world-class Zeiss TZF-9B binocular sights, didn't see a Boxy tank. He saw a target that was already dead. He just hadn't pulled the trigger yet. The 88mm shell traveled at 773 meters per second. At that speed, the trajectory is almost perfectly flat. There is no lobbing the shell. You point, you fire, and the steel travels like a laser beam. The first shell hit the T-34's front plate. It didn't just penetrate, it shattered the armor, sending a spray of white-hot spall, jagged shards of the tank's own interior, into the crew compartment. The T-34 didn't even have time to return fire. This was the 80mm fever beginning to spread. The Allies realized that the Tiger's boxy shape wasn't a flaw. It was a deliberate choice to house a massive internal ring that could support the weight and violence of the 80mm gun. The Tiger didn't need sloped armor because it never intended to let you get close enough to hit it. But as the smoke cleared over the Russian snow, the Allies realized a terrifying truth. The Tiger wasn't just a defensive bunker. In the hands of a commander like Michael Wittmann, it was about to become an apex predator that could hunt in the open. The destruction of that T-34 wasn't an isolated incident or a lucky shot. It was the opening note of a symphony of destruction that would play out across every front of the war. By the time the Western Allies encountered the Tiger in the dusty hills of Tunisia and later the hedgerows of Normandy, the legend of the 80mm had grown into a full-blown psychosis. The British and Americans, who had spent the early years of the war perfecting the art of mobile, flanking maneuvers, suddenly found themselves playing a game of chess against a grandmaster who could take their pieces from across the board. To the men inside a British Sherman, the world was measured in hundreds of yards. Their 75mm gun was a reliable workhorse, but it was designed for the battles of 1941. At 1,000 yards, a Sherman shell would strike the Tiger's vertical 102mm frontal plate and simply shatter. It would leave a splash of lead and a blackened scorch mark, nothing more. To the Tiger crew inside, it sounded like a pebble hitting a tin roof. But for the Tiger, 1,000 yards was point blank. The secret to this terrifying disparity wasn't just the gun, it was the eyes behind it. German tanks were equipped with Zeiss TZF-9B optics. These weren't just glass lenses, they were masterpieces of engineering that provided 2.5x and 5x magnification with a crystal clear field of view. A Tiger gunner didn't just see a tank, he saw the specific rivets on the enemy's turret. He could choose whether to put a shell through the driver's vision slit or the ammunition rack. June 13, 1944, Villers-Bocage, Normandy. The morning mist was still clinging to the tall grass as the British 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, advanced along a narrow sunken road. They were confident. They had survived the North African desert and the beaches of gold. They were veterans. In a nearby orchard, hidden behind a thicket of trees, sat SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann in Tiger 22. He wasn't moving. He didn't need to. He watched through his binoculars as the British column rumbled past, completely unaware that they had just entered a kill zone. Wittmann gave the order. The Tiger's Maybach engine roared to life, a low guttural growl that signaled the end of the world for the men on the road. The 80mm gun traversed with a mechanical whine. Crack. The first shell hit the lead Cromwell tank, instantly turning it into a funeral pyre of white phosphorus and oily black smoke. Crack. The second shell hit the rear vehicle, corking the road. The British were trapped. In the span of just 15 minutes, Wittmann and his crew used the 80mm to systematically dismantle an entire armored regiment. You have to imagine the sensory overload for the British tankers. The air is suddenly filled with the scent of ozone and burning rubber. You look for the enemy, but there is no one there, just a distant puff of gray smoke near a tree line nearly a mile away. You try to traverse your turret, but before your gunner can even find the target in his sights, another 80mm round arrives. It travels so fast that the sound of the explosion and the impact happen simultaneously. One moment your friend's tank is moving, the next the turret is airborne, spinning through the air like a discarded toy. This was the terrifying efficiency of the KWK-36. It turned the Tiger into a long-range sniper that wore 60 tons of steel as a cape. But it wasn't just about the penetration power. The 80mm shell carried a devastating secret inside, a high-explosive filler with a delay-action fuse. When an 80mm shell hit a Sherman or a T-34, it didn't just punch a hole, it punched through the armor, and then, a fraction of a second later, it exploded inside the cramped crew compartment. The result was brewing up, a catastrophic fire that turned the tank's own fuel and ammunition into a blast furnace. As the war progressed, this technological gap created a phenomenon known as Tiger phobia. Allied commanders noticed that their tank crews were becoming hesitant. They would stop their advance if they saw any German tank, even a much smaller Panzer IV, because from a distance, the silhouettes looked similar. They began to report Tigers everywhere, even in sectors where no Tigers existed. The mere possibility of facing the 80mm gun was enough to stall entire divisions. The Allies were desperate. They began welding spare tracks to their tanks, sandbagging their hulls, and even adding concrete layers in a futile attempt to stop the 80mm, but it was like trying to stop a bullet with a sheet of paper. The Tiger seemed invincible. It was the king of the battlefield, a boxy nightmare that couldn't be touched. However, the Allies were learning. They were starting to realize that while you couldn't beat the 80mm in a fair fight, you didn't have to play fair. They were developing a plan to turn the Tiger's greatest strength, its massive, heavy gun, into its terminal weakness. The hunters were about to become the hunted, but the price of that lesson would be written in the blood of thousands of tankers who never saw their killer coming. As 1944 bled into 1945, the Allied High Command realized that the Tiger and its 80mm gun were not just tactical obstacles, they were psychological anchors holding back the liberation of Europe. The British, in particular, grew tired of watching their tanks being brewed up before they could even smell the enemy's exhaust. To kill a Tiger, they realized they didn't need a better tank, they needed a bigger finger. They found it in the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, which they shoehorned into the Sherman to create the Firefly. For the first time, the Allies had a weapon that could talk back to the 80mm. But even with a bigger gun, the Allied tankers knew a terrifying truth. The Tiger was still the apex predator in a head-to-head duel. To win, they had to exploit the Tiger's greatest flaw, its own massive over-engineered weight. The 8.8mm KWK-36 was a heavy piece of artillery. To support it, the Tiger's turret had to be enormous, and the hull beneath it had to be thick. This made the Tiger a 60-ton behemoth. While it could snipe you from 2 miles away on a dry Russian steppe, in the muddy Bocage of France or the crumbling streets of Germany, its weight became a prison. The mechanical heart attack. The Tiger was a victim of its own lethality. Because the 80mm gun was so long and heavy, the turret's traverse was slow. It was powered by a hydraulic system linked to the engine. If the Tiger was idling or the engine stalled, the crew had to manually crank the turret. Allied crews began to use pack tactics. They knew that if they threw 5 Shermans at a single Tiger, the Tiger could probably kill 2 or 3 before they got close. But while the Tiger's gunner was focused on the targets in front of him, the surviving Shermans would sprint for the Tiger's flanks. August 1944. The Falaise Pocket. You are a Tiger. Commander, you've just knocked out a Cromwell at 1/800 yards. But now, 2 more Shermans are charging at you from the left, hidden by a ridge. You scream at your driver to turn the hull, but the ground is soft, and the Tiger's complex interleaved road wheels, a nightmare of overlapping steel discs, are clogged with frozen mud and rocks. One of the inner wheels has seized. You try to swing the turret, but it moves with agonizing slowness. Through your Zeiss optics, you see the Sherman's 75mm gun barrel leveling at your side armor, which is only 80mm thick. Clang. The first shot doesn't penetrate, but it stuns the crew. The second shot, fired from just 200 yards, punches through the fuel tank. The Tiger, the moving bunker that had sniped men from the horizon, is now a 60-ton steel coffin, the legacy of the 88. Even as the Third Reich crumbled, the 80mm gun refused to die. It evolved into the KWK-43L71 for the Tiger II, King Tiger. This barrel was longer, the propellant charge was larger, and its power was so immense that it could theoretically penetrate the front of a Sherman tank, pass all the way through the interior, and exit out the back. But a gun is only as good as the platform that carries it. The King Tiger was even heavier, more prone to breakdown, and thirsty for fuel that Germany no longer had. Many of the most powerful guns of the war were simply abandoned by their crews when they ran out of petrol, or a single 25-cent bolt snapped in the transmission. The 80mm gun changed the rules of engagement forever. It taught the world that in tank warfare, range is life. It paved the way for modern main battle tanks like the M1 Abrams and the Leopard 2, which use high-velocity smoothbore guns to engage targets at distances that would have seemed like science fiction to anyone but a Tiger gunner in 1943. The Allies eventually won through industrial might and sheer numbers, but every veteran who climbed out of a burning tank in the European theater carried a permanent scar of Tiger fear. They knew that somewhere out there, hidden in the gray mist 2 miles away, was a boxy silhouette and a long, thin barrel that could end their world in a single, silent crack.